Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Ken Beer, for those I don't know. Good to see lots of familiar faces and lots of people on Zoom. So hopefully you can see me. Maybe Fitz, give me a thumbs up if you can see me, because I can see you. Oh, good. Excellent. Now we're going to run all sorts of technology here. So fingers crossed it works out, but it's the world we live in. And we've got people dialing in from quite a few areas, and I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge traditional custodians of the land on which we are in person and the many lands we are virtually on. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And we're here for an exciting fatigue seminar, and we've got some wonderful speakers today. We've got some interaction that we'll get you to get involved in, whether you're here in person or online, with some different interactive bits and pieces. And we'll have a little workshop for those who are in person after we say goodbye to our online friends. We'll sit around and have a chat for those who are able to stay. So the agenda is here on the screen. Hopefully others are seeing it there. So we've got Michael Fitzharris from MUARC first, and then we've got Clare Anderson from Monash University and Helen Redden. Hopefully Helen's on Zoom there. Good, excellent. And as we mentioned, the online component, we're sort of going to close off around 3 o'clock, and then there'll be a bit of workshopping for those who are here with us in person. This is being hosted by the Australasian College of Road Safety, the Victorian chapter. So I'm a committee member there, and we have some other committee members in the room. So feel free to reach out to the different committee members and introduce yourself to others and find out a bit about the college and the work we do. And it's all about sharing knowledge in the college, and this is a wonderful opportunity to hear from some of the world experts in this field. And we'll be providing some time for questions as well as the interactive components after the sessions. So without any further ado, I think we will start with our first presentation, and that is from Associate Professor Michael Fitzharris from Monash University Accident Research Centre. And many of you will know Michael has been around the road safety space for many years now, always doing groundbreaking things in a variety of activities, especially around things associated with drink driving, drug driving, fatigue and the like. And many of you have come across Michael also associated with his work with the Enhanced Crash Investigation Study, the TACRS study, which again is a massive bit of work and providing wonderful insights to the road safety community. Michael is a little bit under the weather and decided not to come in here and cough and sneeze on us all. So thank you for that straight off the bat, Michael. And we're going to hear from him through Zoom, where he can sneeze all he wants on his computer, and we won't be too worried. So over to you, and hopefully we'll be able to hear you.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks for the introduction. I'm sure everyone will be quite, as much as I'd like to be there, I'm sure everyone's delighted that I'm not the way I'm currently feeling. This is a very large piece of work. There's quite a lot on the slides. I'm aware some people are familiar with the ECRS study, some are not, but I will sort of skip through or move through some of the method. So at least very briefly, so you can understand. There's a lot available in report 1, which is published, but this was a very large piece of work that looked at the contributing factors and injury outcomes of people involved in serious injury crashes in Victoria, and it was a very large team. Elle, can you go to the next slide? We're going to have to do that. So as you can see, there's a lot of partners. The study was undertaken with the support of the Transport Accident Commission and patient recruitment. So we had nurses in the hospital who enrolled injured drivers or their next of kin for those who were really severely injured. And we had a lot of people involved over many years of work. So I'm very grateful for those. And you can see some of the people, at least their badges there. If we go to the next slide, I always am respectful of the people who have been involved, having a crash at the worst time of their lives and agreeing to participate and let us understand all of their data. There's a lot of ethics around this, so I would ask that people don't take photos of at least the crash. There's a couple of exemplar crashes. And obviously, like everyone in road safety, we want to make sure that the research is translated into outcomes, and that's a real key driver. If we go to the next one, Al, again, this is just the next slide, really just looks at, so just don't post any content on social media. There's quite strict ethics and privacy things about it. And we haven't quite, I used a previous slide about report 2, where we're actually, if you go to the next slide, Al, yeah, there we go. So the ACRS program report 1 will be released, or has, sorry, I'm not on the top of my game, that's for sure. ACRS report 1 was released in late November in 2020, and 2, 3 and 4 will be released as a substantial package a little bit later. So you can sort of see the goal of ACRS was to look at the factors associated with crash occurrence and also injury severity. And really what we're motivated by is looking at what sort of measures could be undertaken to create safe drivers, safe vehicle and safe roads to realise the ambition of Vision Zero over the long run. So the elimination of serious injury. So we have presented a lot of work, and Al, if you go to the next, thanks. So basically how it worked, and this is a really rapid fire overview so people understand the scope of what we did. The study had its own team of research nurses, most emergency department intensive care trained nurses, who would interview people who were admitted to the Alfred or the Melbourne. And you can see the age range there was the full scope, and 37% were rural. But basically people were interviewed where possible, or the next of kin, the family member, for privacy. And we gathered a lot of information, and the vehicle was inspected, the road was inspected, crashes were reconstructed, and there were enormous sources of other information. And we went through a process, and I guess it's a little bit relevant to what we're presenting today, a really detailed process of assessment of contributing factors. So things that were actually implicated in the occurrence of the crash. So things may have been present, but may not, in our view, and on the balance of all of the evidence across all of the work, may not have actually contributed to the crash or the injury. And that's an important thing. So something may be there, but it may be benign to the occurrence of the crash or the nature of the injury. So it was quite an involved process. And that's really the content of the following reports after report 1. If we go to the next one, we also did crash reconstruction. So we reconstructed in 3D and computer. We had a great team there of engineers, and we reconstructed all of the crashes so we could get an understanding of impact speed and pre-crash travel speed in the event. And unfortunately, we were very hopeful that event data recorder, so the black box that was available, it's the nature of these crashes and our current vehicle fleet that wasn't as available to the extent we wanted. So we developed a really sophisticated method, and that was peer reviewed to look at crash speed and some of the findings of that of crash risk and speed exceeding the speed limit is actually in report 1. So you can see that. So we had 400 drivers who had the full gamut of injuries, and there were a lot of other road users involved. So while our focus was actually our 400 drivers, they provided a key in a way to look at the crashes in detail as well. And we had all of the approvals across police and medical records and so on. So all the ethics are covered off, which we're very strong about. We did have a number of people who died as well. So while it's a focus on serious injury, people in another vehicle may have passed away. and a couple of people who were either consented themselves after long length of stays and the complications passed away. So this was done over the August 2014 to December 2016 period. And we had people from crashes from across Victoria. Of course, there's a concentration you can see in urban area, and that sort of indicates our catchment pool of the Alfred initially, and then the Royal Melbourne. And it's important when we're looking at the results in all of the ECIS study to interpret the results on the basis that it's a sample of hospitalised drivers who were injured and treated at major trauma centre. So it's quite a unique, but we did sort of say each driver is worth 15 in the global road trauma space. So that's important as how we scale things and understand the broader thing, but it is important to understand how to interpret this data in that sense. Al, can you move to the next one, please? We did come up, so, these are familiar to people, but it's sort of useful for the basis of this presentation. There are quite significant differences in the movement of vehicles and why crashes happen, but we looked at these sub crashes, sub movements, because they're actually really critical to understand countermeasures. So that's sort of the lens which we created these to sort of understand. So today I'm just going to present at a broad level, lane departure across path and rear impact in relation to driver drowsiness. There's much more to come out of the ECIS study. Elle, thanks. Okay, so what we basically did is we, as I indicated before, we looked at the full range of contributing factors or factors that have contributed to the crashes themselves. And in ECIS report 1, which is available on the MUARC website, free to download, it's a couple of hundred pages. We classified contributing factors into 3 categories. We can see performance fails, so performance failures. So things like we classically think driver error, which is judgment errors, look but fail to see, and so on. Volitional acts, I'll quickly explain, to be driving very close to the vehicle in front of you, and also inattention, and then health and driver state factors, and there's a range of those, and driver state relates to drowsiness and also falling asleep, and then non-compliant behaviours. We had a couple of hundred different behaviours for both all the drivers involved in the vehicle, so as you in the crash, and then this just relates to getting into the crash as distinct from injury severity. So we also looked at things like lack of airbags and impact speed as a driver of crash severity and so on. Well, our key result, I just thought I'd cut to the chase really quickly, given the time, is that about a quarter we saw drowsy driving as a factor, as a observable contributing factor in these hospitalised crashes for these drivers, which is pretty remarkable in the bigger picture. So just quickly to explore these in a little bit more detail, we had drowsy driving and also fell asleep, and there's obviously an important difference between the two, between a non-responsive driver as well. Elle? Thanks. Okay, so these are just 2 examples. I've looked at so many crashes, and I'm always find myself a little bit more traumatized each time because at the end of the day, there's real people in here. The crash on the left, the B vehicle driver who was in his 60s, drifted over the double lines and had what we would call it's about a 15% narrow frontal offset, which is a pretty nasty crash because it misses a lot of the stiff frontal structures of the vehicle, and you can see how the sides of the right sides of the vehicle. The gentleman in the B vehicle, he passed away after 70 odd days in rehab of complications. So I sort of put that up because that's in a 70k zone, and we often think of fatigue related crashes as being the classic lane departure crash in rural area. And it's kind of interesting to look at this data and to see even on the right-hand side, literally around the corner from my house, this was a young female in her 20s, off to work very early in the morning, 4:30 she left home. She wanted a coffee. The store she wanted to grab it from was closed. She kept going. She fell asleep, drifted across the road into that tree, which is still there. and she was in a 1-star car and very severely injured. She had multiple MAS3 plus injuries. And I will say MAS3 and higher, we use the abbreviated injury scale as an index of serious injury. It's serious enough to be admitted to the Alfred and the Melbourne, but this is sort of next level indicator of almost an ICU stay, which we also use, or an injury severity score, major trauma of 12. But this is just for those who don't know, the body is split into various parts: head, face, neck, chest, abdomen and pelvis, upper and lower extremities. And the MAS score is a threat to life score. So you can see that the impact of the B vehicle here on the left side was 71.5 kilometres an hour. Should be survivable, but complications, can change the dimension of that. These are both urban crashes, and I guess I put them there to challenge. This is the nature of the sort of crash that we see, to challenge the notion that that for drowsy driving related crashes are generally believed to be rural lane departure crashes, but that's not the case from our data, although they are dominant, and I'll come to that. Elle, if you move to the next slide. Look, just stepping back, Clare Anderson is much more of an expert on drowsiness versus fatigue than I am in terms of circadian rhythm, so I'll defer to her expertise. But I was aware, just wanted to put this terminology up, that we adopted the term drowsiness in terms of how we called things, and so we just labelled things as drowsiness, as distinct from fatigue, and that's always a source of conversation. The much broader psychological state of fatigue, which can be related to time on task and a whole range of monotonous activities. I guess just for the sake of that, it's useful to look at the two terms. But as I say, we just use the term drowsy driving, and I guess from a risk communication point of view, it's kind of interesting to think about what that means to the general public. But drowsiness or sleepiness is the urge to fall asleep. It's the biological state. So just passing through that, Elle, if we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so this is sort of a key sort of slide, I suppose. We can see all drivers. This is a very busy slide, but we can see here drowsy and falling asleep, and the 3+. So we can see that around a quarter of crashes, but what we see is the classic pattern here, where falling asleep is much more prominent in lane departure crashes and much more prominent in serious injury 3+ crashes. We are starting to split the sample into relatively small numbers, but you can see, as you would expect, no one was coded in an across path intersection crashes having fallen asleep. But there is drowsiness, and I do come to some of the other factors involved in the crash as well. And you can see things like inattention can also play a role and are kind of implicated, implicated in the crash, how people manifest different types of behaviours and make attentional failures and so on, because they are in a drowsy state. Now, falling asleep is a bit of a different category. It's very extreme end of sleepiness. And you can see here, it's interesting, to look at the proportion that's actually higher if fell asleep. And for the lane departure, obviously people falling asleep going into the path of an oncoming vehicle or departing the road to the left or to the right, and getting lucky in the sense of someone else not coming the other way. But these are important, I guess, to unpack these for countermeasures. And it's kind of useful also to monetize the crashes, because we get an understanding at least of what the countermeasures. And I've used hybrid human capital willingness to pay costs that I used in the GTR 14 site impact global rule that the feds accept. So you can see here, serious injury 3+ crashes are much more severe, as you would expect. These are people who have significant, sometimes impairment for life as well, but it's about $1 million for a drowsiness related crash, correct myself there. And we're looking at something around nearly 500 million, 418 million, at least on these estimates as well, and they were indexed to the end of 2018. So, there's some pretty significant findings there. Al, if we go to the next one, I'm skipping through because I am mindful of the time. I think one of the things here is when we look overall, one of the beauties of ECIS is to be able to unpack all of the crashes in really enormous detail. And we see that there's about more in the urban overall, and we can see how those across path and rear impact, they're, again, very small numbers. But you can see, interestingly, it's about 45, 55 urban and regional in terms of lane departure crashes. And of course, they're much higher impact in lane departure crashes in speed zones of greater than 80, and that obvious classic pattern of CN local roads. So basically high speed local roads, but they're not necessarily always in the regions, and that's something to consider as well. And if we think back to that case, it sort of happened, the earlier case where the two vehicles collided because someone drifted over. It was in the proximity of an intersection. So from an infrastructure countermeasure design, it's quite challenging, but things can, of course, be done in that sort of space. And we see with the rear impact crashes, there's a very small number where they literally just fall asleep and drive into the back of someone or drive into a parked car at the side of the road. We have been very careful to split apart incidents of physical health, so sudden sickness, so things like coronary events, uncontrolled diabetes, and we've seen lots and lots of different factors associated, but they're coded as sudden sickness, but they're a different type of non-responsive driver as well. If we go to the next slide. Okay, so this is sort of really interesting. I haven't put the 3+ because we're getting into pretty low numbers. I mean, we've got 98 drivers who were injured of the 400 where drowsiness was a factor. And we can see that error is often implicated with drowsiness. So people making erroneous decisions obviously can be associated with their sleep state or their lack of alertness, perhaps I should say. And we see here some differences in driving actions. The driving actions is interesting because it's following too close, but also looking at driving adverse to the conditions. So people might be driving at a speed that is completely within the speed limit, but with terms of weather conditions and so on, beyond what we had judged to be appropriate. And you can see inattention. Now, what's not there is people attending to things outside, mind wandering outside the vehicle and so on. So it doesn't all add up to 100. But you can see inner thoughts as mind wandering, and passenger and phone use interactions, interestingly, are really, really non-existent in this sample. Whether, and dare I say, a protective effect, because people often will ring someone or talk to a passenger to keep them at least engaged or awake, is an interesting safety risk aspect. And we can see here some health related factors. Now, what I really am interested when I looked at this data, we do a lot of work in mental health and psychological distress. And of course, Schedule 8 medications like opioids and benzodiazepines are often implicated in drowsiness if they're misused, which in this, we can see that that's how we've coded these. But in terms of mental health and psychological distress, disrupted sleep patterns, and this really comes out, I've seen the people in the case files very clearly where sleep patterns are entirely disrupted, associated with mental health, and that's really coming out there as well. And it excludes deliberate self-harm, which unfortunately we did see as well. And acute illness is probably where I sit at the moment. I won't be getting in a car anytime soon, coughing and spluttering. But these are people who are acutely sick, and of course that can affect their sleep as well. Interestingly, most of the non-compliance around alcohol and drugs, nearly 70-75% upwards, were not exceeding their blood alcohol or had illicit drugs on board. So around 3/4 of crashes, which is interesting. Of course, some of these substances, alcohol and illicit drugs, of course, exacerbate the effect of poor sleep. So if you want a good sleep, don't drink and don't take drugs, and certainly don't drive. That's Michael's tip for the day. And of course, we see here exceeding the speed limit, and people who are drowsy, distracted, and so on, when often these things go together, So it's interesting when we consider these other co-occurring factors, they do have good reason to co-occur, but it does make opportunities to do countermeasures a sort of an interesting thing from a policy point of view. Next, I think it's the last slide. Okay, so clearly we see in our sample of hospitalised drivers at the Alfred and the Melbourne. So don't forget, you know, for the rural people, they would have come in on HEMS, on the helicopter. So this is quite a severe sample. Half of our sample had an MAS 3+. So it's not representative of the broader police reported casualty crashes. So we do need to bear that in mind, but we can line up the countermeasures for hospitalised crashes, and then the subset, of course, half and half, worked out quite neat around we can prioritise countermeasures across different injury severity levels. So we can see a driver falling asleep is interesting. That's obviously that's obviously quite the extreme end, and of course the classic lane departure, but we see some of those in rear impacts where people, you know, literally drift off the road into something else. And I just wanted to challenge the idea that they're exclusively rural lane departure. They do happen in urban areas as well, and that's obviously everyday life. They have very high costs. They have lots of other factors involved. And I think one of the interesting things, again, was the mental health and the use of medications. These things can exacerbate poor sleep as well. And I'm not going to go into countermeasures because that can be a later discussion, and it's the subject of our following reports, which are still in play in terms of being developed. But I am happy to answer questions around what sort of countermeasures in terms of vehicle tech, driver focus measures, and obviously Ken can tell you all about infrastructure solutions, being from Safe System Solutions. Once I get the S right, Ken, on your email, mate. And I think these are all things that we need to do to address what really is a quarter of crashes where 75% are not impaired by alcohol or drugs. Last slide, I think, Al, is just a thank you slide to all of the amazing people involved. And we won't go through that, but it is in the report. And I think the last slide, Al, is my team, which we can see, and then the last slide, and it is the last slide, is me looking like a crash test dummy ready for your questions. Thank you, and I'm sorry if I took a little bit longer. Cheers.
Thank you, Michael. That was wonderful, fascinating stuff, and we could be going through that data all day. We will continue on. I think I'm going to jump straight into a little Menti, which is just a little way for you to have a bit of interaction before we get our next speaker. We probably will hold off on immediate questions just to catch up a little bit of time, but I'm sure there's going to be opportunity at the end if we have time. For those of you who know how to use Menti, you just need any phone or any device. If you're there on Zoom, just open up a new browser and you go to menti.com. And then you put in that code, which is 21 69 85 34, no gaps. And then you will hopefully come in there and we're going to ask a little question of you. So maybe hit on the love heart button to show us you're there. Look at Jerome, uses this every day of his life. He's always in Menti. Oh, good. We're seeing lots of people. So I'll give it 5 more seconds and then we'll just do a question associated with Michael's presentation, and then our other presenters have got a few in there. So we're sharing the screen there? Yeah. Just share that. Perfect. So good. Hopefully those at home are seeing that. I'll give it 5 more seconds because I think people at home are just finding their feet on the Menti, code 21 69 85 34. While we just pause there, if there was an immediate question from the room from Michael, I can feed that through now. When? Michael, the question from Wendy is, do you know why people were driving? Were they coming home from work? Were they going to work? Were they driving for other reasons? Do you know anything around that?
Yeah, we know all of it. Where we could speak to people, which was nearly quite a lot of them, or family, as to the purpose of the trip, as well. It was a mix. There were some people coming home from work, and there were people who were just going about everyday work activities, everything, the full gamut. So very, very challenging. So there were some work-related crashes as well, some people coming back from medical treatment. So we do have a full gamut of people as well, across the morning and across the day.
Thanks, Michael. Now, the Menti is up now, and it's got 3 questions there where you would be able to rate them on a scale there from low to high. And it's just your opinion on this, and we'll be interested to see what people think. So the first one, how important is vehicle technology in preventing serious injuries in these crashes? So the ones that Michael has been talking to. The second one, how is important infrastructure in preventing serious injury in these crashes? And you saw instances of cruise control being used, drivers falling asleep. To what degree do you agree drivers becoming too dependent on some vehicle technologies, I think is a word that seems to have slipped off the end there. So the last word being technology. So let's, there we go there. We're getting lots of responses in. Thank you. A nice little way for us to see some things. Now, Michael, I hope you're seeing this on the screen as well.
I am, Ken. It's really interesting. I'll just say that the cruise control was seen both in people who literally fell asleep, and unfortunately some people set the cruise control, if we can tell from EDR, event data recorder, black box data, where we had it, or where they caused so much damage to the vehicle, the needle got stuck in the car on the speed as well. But the EDR data really was our source there. And we could see that. We asked people if they used it as well. It was relatively small, but sufficient, and they were very, very severe, because there were instances where people might have set the cruise control at slightly above the speed limit, even slightly over 100, and have fallen asleep. And we also saw that with some medical illness, medical events, which is just disastrous as well. It is interesting from an infrastructure point of view, that really vehicle technology, perhaps in the long run, from my perspective, will probably be a really significant saviour in terms of driver monitoring systems and occupant status monitoring, and other things like lane departure warning and so on. But of course, the integration with infrastructure and infrastructure design, rumble strips and all of those things, and certain barrier solutions, but even rumble strips can play a really important role. So it's interesting to see how people are ranking things pretty high, which is is really good. What's perhaps missing there is a potential focus on the driver and some education stuff around fleet safety, because we did see that. I didn't present it, in around 8 to 10%. And there was a question from Greg around trucks, and we did see involvement of trucks in some of these crashes as well. So that's some of the fleet safety policy and fatigue management stuff becomes important.
Thanks, Michael. We're going to have to move on, but I think that is interesting. And for those hanging around for a bit of workshopping after, we may come back to this data, but we will keep moving on. So thank you, Michael. Appreciate your presentation. And we're going to have our next presenter come up now. So Elle, if you can work the computer. And yes, good point. And Claire, you come up and I'll have a bit of a chat to you, and we will get some Menti questions going while we're on there. So hold here for a second. Now, you should still be on Menti, and Claire, who we will have a chat to and introduce shortly, wanted these questions at the start, and then we might revisit them later on just to see how things have gone there. So jump back into your Menti and have a go at this first one, which is what is the minimum amount of sleep that someone should get before driving a motor vehicle? And I'll only give you another sort of 15 seconds to do this because I've got another couple of questions for you. But Claire is here looking at those results come in. And I'll ask you, Claire, what is your official title? And where do you work?
So also at Monash, but in the Turner Institute for Brain and Mental Health. So I'm a sleep and circadian scientist with an interest in road safety. And my program kind of covers everything from how the sleep circadian system influences performance. So road safety is one of them, but also healthy aging, the development of biomarkers in relation to aging and safety, all of those things.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next Menti question, and then we'll pop that up. The next one is, how risky is driving while drowsy relative to driving under the influence of alcohol? So we've got considerably more risky, about the same, less risky, or considerably less risky. So we'll vote on that, and then I'll ask you, but it does not sound quite like an Australian accent, but how long have you been an Australian researcher?
Yep, a bit of a hybrid. So my training was in the UK. So from Loughborough, who was part of the previous trial, I noticed. And so I trained with Jim Horn, who was a huge campaigner for road safety many, many years ago. I left the UK in 2008. I then worked in the United States, and I was in Boston for 3 years, and I've been in Australia since 2011. So I'm pretty Australian now. When I go to England, they tell me I'm Australian. When I'm here, I get told I'm British. So.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to move on to the final question here. This is interesting. Most people are saying about the same. So Claire's noting all of this. The last one, a quick one here. Are drivers aware of sleepiness? Yes or no? Are they aware of sleepiness? And we'll let people have a vote on that while I ask you the last question. Being a sleep guru, how do you sleep?
I hate this question, and it's because I have to admit, not the best. I have 2 small children. I have a crazy job. And I'm often disturbed in the night. We run studies 24 hours a day. Everything we care about occurs at night. And I do get calls if things go wrong. I think the difference is I don't worry about it, and I take action if I don't sleep. So best practice, but it's certainly not a case of I'm not the perfect sleeper. Physician, heal ourselves, all those things.
Okay. And we've got almost a 50-50, but more in the know there. So maybe we'll jump over to the slides and we'll hear a bit of a presentation. We might come back to that shortly and see if anything presented changes your mind or your opinion on some of those questions. So over to you.
Thank you. Alrighty, we're good. Are we sharing online?
You just do share. Okay. Yeah. That's all right. So just share the entire screen. Yep. That's it.
Okay, am I good?
Yeah.
Excellent, perfect. So I'm going to be talking about a study that we've been doing for a while now, and that is a dose response study. So where we change the amount of sleep that an individual has prior to their vehicle to try and get to this kind of really fundamental question: how much sleep should somebody be getting while driving a motor vehicle? And importantly, if we set a threshold of what is required for safe driving, how do we detect that level of sleep above and below the line? So the first question is, why is it important to understand the how much prior sleep somebody has before driving? One is in terms of educating drivers to avoid risk. Sometimes when I look at the advice given to drivers, and it will literally say things like, make sure you get enough sleep before driving, And it's kind of vague around, well, what is enough? How much should I be getting? What's right for me? All of those things. So I think giving more kind of specific advice to individuals so they can best change behavior, then it's important. Also from a forensic examination perspective to inform of a fall asleep crash. Often when we're looking at fall asleep crashes, and I'm sure Michael has seen this, where you're trying to kind of unpick whether fatigue or drowsiness was involved, and you often say to a driver, did you fall asleep? Often they say no. Many people are not aware of falling asleep. You have to be asleep for a considerable amount of time before you know you've been asleep. As people fall asleep, they go to sleep, they wake up, they go to sleep, they wake up. And it's almost over a minute you have to be asleep before you know you've been asleep. So often when you ask drivers if they fell asleep, they will say no. But when you ask different questions about symptoms of sleepiness, then you kind of get some different responses. So trying to identify how much sleep that individual had the night before and how that relates to driving risk, I think is really important. And then finally, the roadside testing perspective. Obviously, the introduction of roadside testing of alcohol had a huge impact on the reduction of motor vehicle crashes due to the ability to detect impairment, due to the ability to give people a threshold, don't go above this threshold. And if we can do the same in relation to fatigue, we can probably make a huge impact into management of drowsiness at roadside. Now, I will also say that I realize that I'm switching between fatigue and drowsiness. I completely concur with Michael that we should use drowsiness. I always use drowsiness, and only when I came to Australia did I start using fatigue because people were using it. But I'm very much in support of shifting the terminology towards drowsiness. Drowsiness is a fluctuating physiological state, this moment-to-moment fluctuation from kind of I'm okay, I'm not okay, I'm okay, I'm not okay. And drowsiness is the appropriate terminology. So we know it's important, but how much sleep is enough? A couple of studies out there that gives an indication of where the risk lies in relation to prior sleep. So historically, when people used to say to me, how much sleep should a driver get, or when is a driver most at risk due to prior sleep, we would use the 5 hours as a reference, and that's primarily because of an Australian study where they looked at the risk of a crash where the car occupant was injured as a result of prior sleep, and 5 hours was where they saw that enhanced risk. Now, that's not because they looked at 2 hours and 3 hours and 4 hours and 5 hours. They just looked at 5 hours above and below and saw that risk. So then there's different approaches where you get a consensus group together to say, well, how much sleep is enough? And they go through the evidence and they come up with it. And a consensus group felt that 2 hours was the minimum level that should be undertaken by any driver, although 3 to 5, they acknowledge that 3 to 5 hours would cause impairment. And then we've got more kind of epidemiological approaches. So this is a recent study, Brian Teft in the United States, looking at culpability of a motor vehicle crash for drivers who were involved, and looked at it as a function of prior sleep. So relative to sleeping 7 to 9 hours, those drivers who had 5 hours or less of sleep were 2.9 times more likely to be responsible for that motor vehicle crash. Whereas when it dropped to 4 hours and less than 4 hours, you can see that the jump in risk of being responsible for that crash was huge. So what we see then, it depends what you look at. Is it consensus? Is it epidemiological data? You know, how do we find out how much sleep we should be advising drivers? So we kind of took an experimentalist approach to this. And we basically took drivers, we changed the amount of prior sleep that we had, and then we observed them driving. So how much sleep was associated with unsafe driving, and can we predict that amount of sleep? And this was a project funded by Road Safety Victoria, Department of Transport. I will say that these data are not finalised. We have a couple more participants to run. Unfortunately, COVID did stop the end of this trial. So again, I would ask no pictures of the data, because we will be updating these slightly. So what we did is we looked at, as I said, 4 different levels of prior sleep. So we looked at individuals after 8 hours of sleep. So they have 8 hours of sleep in the night prior to the drive, and then we drive in the afternoon for 2 hours. We then did a 5-hour sleep restricted condition, and then they, again, identical study conditions, 3 hours of restricted sleep, and then finally after 0 sleep. So they drive a fully instrumented vehicle around a closed loop track. We monitor them for brain waves, so we're looking at incidences of microsleep. We're looking at eye closures. Ocular parameters are really, really sensitive when we're trying to look at drowsiness. We're also looking at lane departures. So when the car, at least two wheels of the car go over either lane. We look at emergency braking. So there is an instructor in the car with these individuals. And so what we're trying to do in a safe way, we're trying to look at people essentially to end states. Like Michael was saying, we're trying to capture those signs of drowsiness, but then we're also trying to capture that end state where somebody does lose control of a vehicle, they do fall asleep, and we do have an instructor to hit the emergency brake and safely stop the vehicle. And we use that as one of our kind of hard endpoints. And then, of course, we ask drivers throughout the drive, how sleepy do they feel, and a number of other questions. So in terms of, this is just an example of one of the individuals driving our study. And then we've got, this is at the METEC Driver Training Center that we use for these studies. The study outcomes, essentially, we have driving impairment, we look at driver ratings, we have standard measures. So these are kind of gold standard measures that we use in lab from a sleep science perspective. And we really use that to make sure that the protocol is doing what the protocol is designed to do, and that is induce sleep-related impairment. And then finally, we have a device. As I said, this was part of a larger program of work to see if we can detect whether somebody has slept above and below a specific threshold, and also whether we can predict the level of impairment due to that threshold. So in terms of the study, what we can see in the week prior, as I said, we take a pretty careful experimental approach to this. So first of all, we look at total sleep time leading into the study. We carefully control to make sure everybody is sleep satiated. They've had enough sleep opportunity. This is not chronic sleep restriction. This is a single night that we change. So you can see no change in the week prior to the study. And then we can see the amount of sleep the night before. So 8 hours well rested, the 5 hour, the 3 hour, the 0 hour. Of course, when you give people a sleep opportunity, the amount of sleep that they get within that sleep opportunity is always slightly less. You can just see how much sleep they got, how much sleep they lost. So just under 7 hours in the well-rested condition, just over 4 hours, or nearly 4.5 hours in the 5 hour condition, 2.5 hours in the 3 hour condition, and obviously 0 hours in the 0 hour condition. And these individuals are in the lab monitored by us, and we verify this pretty carefully. In terms of the in-lab assessment, so protocol did as the protocol was meant to. So we can see here a number of lapses on a psychomotor vigilance task. This is just where they've not responded in a timely manner on a simple task of sustained attention. So when they're well rested, and we can see this dose response as a function of an increasing sleep loss, and that was significant at the group level, and each post-hoc was also significant as well. From a KSS perspective, all conditions, 3 hours, 5 hours, and 0 hours of sleep, people felt significantly sleepier relative to when they were well rested. Again, we can see the impact of this intervention in terms of lapses. So up to 113% increase in lapses with total sleep deprivation, and a small increase in lapses with 5 hours sleep restriction. And again, you can see the relative change in KSS, the Karolinska Sleepiness Scale. When we get to the driving and the track, we do ask people every 15 minutes how sleepy they feel. So this is a little bit different than when people are driving in their everyday environments. Most people aren't driving around asking how sleepy they feel, apart from probably many of us in this room. So we did ask our drivers, and we can see here, again, we have an effective condition. So with changes in prior sleep, we have drivers saying that they feel sleepier. We have a change as a function of drive time. So as we move through a 120-minute drive, we can see that drivers are starting to feel more sleepy across the drive as well. Now, what we also did is looked at the KSS themselves, rather than just looking at the KSS as this 1.1 to 9 point scale and looking at it as an average. There are certain scores that we know are associated to risk. So we've just completed a paper, actually, that I did while I was in the United States, and it's taken this long for me to do the paper and write up and submit. I've had 2 children before I wrote this paper, so I can make 2 humans where I can publish this. But we do show that people this was a study that was on road in interns, medical residents driving to and from work, that we monitored in a naturalistic setting for 3 weeks. And we looked at how the KSS linked to their driving impairment. We also did exactly the same study design as I've just described, again, looking at KSS and driving impairment. And we know that the KSS was strongly linked to driving impairment, both in terms of lane departures, ocular parameters, but also in terms of kind of end stage events. So a KSS of 7 and above, there was a 20 increased odds of an emergency brake in the next 15 minutes, and almost a 6 times increased odds of a JDS, which is a John's drowsiness score from an Optalert system, in the next 15 minutes. And that JDS score of 4.5 was set because it was associated to a car leaving the carriageway. So when we look at the number of scores during that drive where drivers said they had a KSS of 7 or more, I'm sleepy, but I'm not really struggling to keep awake, we can see that even just 5 hours of sleep restriction, there was 74% of scores were 7 and above. 3 hours, 68% were 7 and above, and with 0 hours of sleep, almost 80% of those scores were 7 and above. It's frightening when we see scores of 9, and often when we have people in the laboratory and they hit a 9, we see people who are really struggling to stay awake. And again, in this study, we found that in the 5-hour restriction, 25% or 24% of scores were a 9 and above. And when people have had 3 hours and 0 hours, you can see that almost half of all of those scores, those KSS scores, while they were driving after a night without sleep, were a score of 9. This is a driver saying, I'm very sleepy and I'm fighting sleep. In terms of impairment, lane deviations per 15 minutes, again, we can see the dose response effect. So we've got drive duration. So we basically look at driving impairment every 15 minutes throughout the drive, from 0 hours right through to 120. So we can see a slight variation, but no difference for well rested. Whereas when we look at 5 hours sleep restriction for lane departures and 3 hours sleep restriction in orange here for lane departures, that was significantly different to well rested. And then of course this, the 0 hours total sleep deprivation, what you see in the first 15 minutes, people generally do okay, and then they just, they really do struggle to remain in control of the vehicle, with a dramatic increase in lane departures during the drive. And again, when we look at it from the group effect, you can see that dose response in lane deviations per 15 minutes as a function of prior sleep. When we look at it in terms of the risk of having a lane departure, so 5 hours sleep restriction is 2.74 times, 3 hours sleep restriction is 3.45, and 0 hours is 3.76 times. And again, these are all significant. Now, lane departures are, they are difficult to look at sometimes in experimental setting. These lane departures are basically verified by 3 different people, by the instructor themselves, and then 2 of us back in the lab verifying that that lane departure was a true lane departure caused by impairment. But we also look at the end point. This is when the instructor hits the brake, there is a serious event about to happen and they intervene. And so we look at this in terms of both cumulative times that the brake is hit across the drive duration, and then we can look at it in % survival in terms of when we end that drive. So again, we see this very clear dose response relationship, that when you within the same person, this is the only study that has ever done a within subject dose response with a real driving outcome in a really controlled experimental way, that we can see how changing prior sleep for just one night changes a hard outcome, which is a driver who is fallen asleep at the wheel. So obviously this is just behind the little stop sharing. I'm not sure if I can move that. I don't want to, so I don't want to stop sharing. But essentially it shows you the median time of the drive being terminated. And for that 0 hours, was it 72 minutes? So that is essentially 50% of the cohort where their drive had been terminated, was it 72 minutes. So half of them were ended in the drive. So for 5 hours sleep restriction, 5 times more likely to have an endpoint where the instructor has to hit, 11.8 times more likely for the 3 hour. And I think beneath there is about 15, 16 times more likely when somebody has 0 sleep whatsoever. So I think if we think back to those first earlier, numbers, whether it's 2 hours, is it 3 hours, is it 4 hours, is it 5 hours, what we can see from an experimental perspective, certainly 2 hours is way too low. We're seeing levels of risk that are much higher than what we would expect. If we think about it from a blood alcohol perspective, these are way higher than what we thought we would see. So I think this makes, it doesn't take over the previous studies that we've seen. Experimental data is equally as important as other data, but it does add to the picture of where we should be setting the line to advise people when not to drive. In terms of predicting, so this study we did have pre-drive assessments. So we had 2 types of assessment. One was a device that we're using to see if we can predict impairment. We also take blood tests. So a program of work that I've been involved in for some time now that I'm not presenting today is taking a blood test to see how long somebody has been awake, and we can predict with very, very high accuracy how long an individual has been awake. And we did do that within this study and others. We obviously can look at continuous monitoring during the drive with technology, and we're also doing that. But then we can look at after the drive and predict backwards. So saying, was that drive impaired? And this is really important from a roadside perspective. So what we use is a device looking at pupillography. There are many devices out there, but this is a good device because it's a prediction device, not a continuous monitoring device. And it just uses changes in the pupil in a stable environment. So basically it's looking at autonomic nervous system shifts, which we see with drowsiness. That can be picked up through cardiac events, it can be picked up through ocular events, and we're picking it up through the changes in the pupil as a function of sleep loss. So this is a well-rested person's pupil, relatively stable, slight movement, and this is an individual when they're sleep deprived, you see these huge variations. So again, I won't go into the data, but I'm going to describe the process that we've been through to show that we are making advances in how much sleep somebody should have and how can we best detect that accurately. So we have developed a threshold using this device for what we consider a failed test. We have then determined the accuracy of that in predicting different outcomes. So 6 times, if somebody has a failed test, looking backwards, it was 6 times more likely to have had insufficient sleep the night before, defined as 0 or 3 hours versus 5 and 8. They were 12.9 times more likely to have had a near crash event on that drive, and 25 times more likely to have had the drive terminated on the grounds of safety by the instructor. Obviously, we have an approach where we are very, very focused on false positives. Often in road safety, we're focused on sensitivity, capturing everybody who is impaired. We also have a very strong commitment to false positives, making sure that we don't get it wrong and classify somebody as being impaired when they're not. And in terms of next steps, obviously, we think this device is important, but we are obviously looking for other approaches, such as the blood approaches and other biological markers as well. But just in terms of what we've got, avoid driving after less than 5 hours of sleep. We obviously, we're looking at 3 hours, never drive less than 3 or 4 hours of sleep, and always take alternative means. One single night of restricted sleep can lead to unsafe driving. We know that chronic sleep deprivation is worse. People lose their frame of reference. They feel that they're safe and they're not. And that build-up of sleepiness over several days is as unsafe as a single night without sleep. Detection of prior sleep and impairment are both possible. So we are trying to do work to move toward this. And it really takes a multifaceted approach, collaboration of partners in order to approach this. Everything from understanding thresholds, understanding the use of technology, implementation, policy implications, medical legal perspectives, buy-in from the public, lots of different things we have to think about to move this forward. And just acknowledging the funding source, collaborators, lots of people were involved in the study. And thank you to everybody for listening today.
Thanks, Claire. We might get Elle to bring up the Menti again. We're running a little bit behind time, but we know that we did have some time in the bank here for our people in person, and some those on Zoom may have to jump out, but others will be able to stay around. We do have another presenter, and thank you for that. I mean, any questions from the group as this comes up? Immediate questions? Yes.
Would you look at that and look at that reflecting sort of observation?
No, we haven't stepped into it. As I said, we've not finished the study yet. So the other thing that might be, it could just be the fact that a couple of people are moving it. These are small samples. They're not huge numbers. So it could be that a couple of people pull that bump up rather than it being a true bump at 45 to 60 minutes. We'd have to step into it and look at it. But we've certainly not done that at the moment.
Now we have the Menti back up and running. Some questions, just seeing if it's altered based on what the information you've just heard there from Claire. Yeah. With the lane departure, as this is going on, 3 hours sleep said better than 5 hours sleep. Is that just, again, the small numbers?
Probably, yeah, small numbers. I think sometimes, when people know they've had severely restricted sleep, they take a little bit more care, particularly in the first part of the drive. And so when we look at this, we're looking at this minimum number now. Is it 5 hours? If it's 6 hours? I think we've got to, we want a number that we can advise people to say, be careful around this time, but then there needs to be a bottom line of you cannot drive. I think if you set it too high, ideally we want everybody spending 7 hours and then driving, but I think if you set it, you've got shift workers, you've got people, and it's just not achievable. You then can't detect it, so at some point you've got to set a line where you give education that this is ideal, but this is where you don't drive. So I think there's going to be different thresholds depending on the information that you're given. But certainly when you look at the end point, 3 versus 5, 3 is very much impaired relative to 5.
Okay.
Yep.
There we go. Let's go to the next one. This was relative to driving under the influence of alcohol. I'm forgetting exactly where people were last time. So
It's kind of shifted to the left.
It has shifted. What's your comment on that?
Yeah, so there was a study back in the 90s, which is a long time ago now, where people equated sleep deprivation with alcohol. So basically looking at PVT in lab and saying that performance impairments after alcohol after 1 night without sleep was comparable to kind of double the legal limit. So I think we kind of thought that it sat around there, but of course, nobody's looked at it in a driving context. What is the risk in driving with alcohol, with the driving with sleep deprivation that's done in a controlled way, same participants, and looking at the relative risk as well. So certainly the risk factors we're seeing for a crash or a near crash event seem to be more risky, which we expected it to be about the same.
Okay. Good. Let's do the last one. We're getting lots of people answering these, which is great. And our drivers are aware of sleepiness. So
yeah.
Yes, please.
A lot of people take their own time. So that comes down your blood pressure level. If that's what you want.
Yeah. So in terms of the bloods, we control for everything. So nobody would be in a study. So first of all, they wouldn't get into the study if they were taking any medication. But then when they come into the study, we do urine tests and make sure that no caffeine, no alcohol, no drugs in the system. So certainly coming into the study, when we take the bloods, it's clean. So we've developed a blood-based biomarker. It's a metabolomic marker. And when we look at the metabolites that come out and predict sleep deprivation, they're not linked to established sleep mechanisms. So they're not associated to caffeine. They're not associated to melatonin, all of those things. So it's kind of separate. So it's very carefully controlled. It's the only way we can develop it. And of course, now we've got to go out and test that biomarker as we're all, in our environments, different diets, different exercise, light, all of those things. We think it's robust. We've done some follow-up studies and it's looking robust, but the biomarker we've got should not be affected by those parameters. Yeah. So essentially we just basically looked at the blood and we said, what in the blood tells me that this person's sleep deprived and this person isn't? We did machine learning approach, pulled out different things. And then what you do is you identify what that metabolite is. Metabolite's a bit different to proteins and genes where we kind of know what they are. It's taken us about 7 years to find it, 5 of them. It's been a huge process. We're there. And then we develop standards. So then we can test it repeatedly at a threshold. Thank you.
Okay, we're doing well. It's some fascinating stuff here, and we have another wonderful presenter as our final presenter before we have a bit of workshopping in the room here. And our final presenter is Helen Redden from the TAC, and again, many of you will know Helen, and she started at the TAC in 2017 and is part of the team responsible for increasing awareness and behavioural change in the areas of alcohol, other drugs, cycling, driver fatigue, and distraction. And before that, she had a number of years outside that in the drug and alcohol field, in case management, community engagement, education and policy. So we're excited to hear from Helen on some of her wonderful projects happening. And we'll just double check everybody's seeing. Are you seeing your slides, Helen?
I can see mine. Can you see them?
We've got them and we've got you and we can hear you loud and clear. So off you go.
Yay. So hello everyone, welcome from sunny Jan Jack. My body has also hosted influenza A, COVID, and most recently Bali Belly. So, you know, wasn't keen on a almost 3-hour public transport trip to be there. So sorry I can't be there. And thank you to Michael and Claire. And Claire, I'm sure we will be in the same room soon. We've been trying for a while. So I realize how over time we are, so I'll be really quick. The particular project I want to speak about today is some formative research we did. And this research is ahead of an above the line or TV campaign we have planned for drowsy driving in the middle of next year. So this is the start of the process of us understanding what your regular punter, you know, on our roads thinks about drowsy driving. So I'll move on to my next slide. It's not working. I'll try this one. Oh, there we go. So I just want to give you a really quick recap. Some of these previous campaigns you might be familiar with. Bottom right-hand corner was the infamous Combi campaign, and that was 1994. The blurred image you can see, 2005, but we actually haven't had a TV campaign since March 2018, which is You Can't Find Sleep. So I think you'd all agree it's about time we revisit this, and what a great timing to actually talk about drowsy driving to the community. So what do we do? So this research was conducted in the middle of April, and we had 4 key areas. It says 3, but I'm tricking you. It's actually 4. So we wanted to explore the understanding of drowsiness with a group of people, to explore their understanding of the relationship between drowsy driving and risk, which is really important. Identify beliefs and behaviours that lead to their own drowsy driving or experience of driving while tired, and also to understand what strategies and behaviours people implement to avoid drowsy driving. So as I said, these insights will be used to inform our drowsy driving community education campaign. So great timing to actually be talking about sleep. As I'm sure you're all aware, sleep has become sort of high on the agenda of wellness and well-being, and you know, people have got their sleep monitors and, you know, often checking about, you know, how many hours they slept the night before. So the timing's good to actually, you know, bring this a step forward, if you like, and talk about, you know, what is the impact of sleep on driving. So so as I said, and what Claire and Michael have spoken about as well, so the hours of sleep, or the hours of measurement of sleep, are a common conversation, and most generally believe 8 hours is a good amount of sleep. Sleep challenges, as you know, some of us know, when having small children or even older children waiting for them to get home, vivid dreams, getting to sleep, and difficulty in falling back to sleep if woken. So also, you know, some of the sleep problems as well can be an issue there. So a measure of good night's sleep is how you feel when people wake up. And this is what people were reporting to us. So what do we do? So we focused on the identified risk groups. So young drivers, shift workers, parents, regional drivers, occupational drivers, and people with diagnosed sleep disorders. We also got the participants to do a pre-group task, so reflecting on their experience of driving while tired, and you know, what led to their decision to do this. So we did have 6 focus groups and 12 in-depth interviews. So 5 shift workers, 5 drivers with diagnosed sleep disorder, and 2 parents of infants. So we've kind of already discussed this, but why are people driving while tired? And Michael, I think your research actually showed this as well, but driving home after night shift, just a desire to get home, which may explain some of those, you know, those urban crashes as well. You know, it's not far. I don't have far to go. I know these roads, I'll get home quickly. Feeling pressure to drive long distances for an employer, and being relied on by someone else, like elderly parent who can't drive, or, you know, needing to drive kids around to school and you've got an infant that's kept you up all night. So, and no other options as well. So no other public transport. So why are they driving tired? And we sort of touched on this. So drivers believe there's 3 options available to them. So there's absolutely no option but to drive. They implement strategies, which I'll get into, or just choosing not to drive. So obviously the third one sometimes just isn't an option. So that can be an issue. So the level of risk perception, and I think this is really important, and getting back to Claire's point as well, I think the education, of risk is really what we're trying to look at, how we present that risk in our next campaign. And I'll get to that in a little bit of time. So Victorian drivers know that driving when fatigued is risky, yet perception of risk varies according to the individual situation and environmental factors. And I think that won't come as a surprise to anyone. So those individual factors, extent of my fatigue, how fatigued am I, or how tired am I, quality of sleep, self-confidence in driving, so situation, time of day, distance, regional, rural, and weather, road conditions, infrastructure. So, and generally, and this is really interesting, driving tired is considered normal and less risky than drink or drug driving. So, that's a bit of a red flag for us, and maybe an opportunity to talk to that perception. So information, so what people want to know the risks. So the information gaps seem to appear to be about the understanding of the level of risk. So obviously some of Claire's research and Michael's as well, we could, potentially talk to that as evidence of the risk. So situations associated with greater risk, obviously time of day, strategies they can implement, coffee, loud music, window down, as some of those strategies people spoke to us about. Those that had more comprehensive knowledge, and when I say more comprehensive knowledge, there was some lived experience as well. A couple of the people in the groups either had been in a crash where they'd, fallen asleep at the wheel, or knew someone that did. So for them, it was how risk compares to other risk-taking behaviour. So that came up quite a bit. So they want to know, I think, having that comparison, and, as Claire was mentioning, we potentially will be looking at that as well, and new research around, comparing that risk to being over 0.05. The effectiveness of strategies for staying awake, and statistics with the risk of driving while fatigued. So there's some of the information that people would like to know, and I've just got some grabs there of what people were saying. So how should we tackle the campaign? So the formative research found that people understand that drowsy driving is risky, but they don't know how risky it is. So obviously they also mentioned, and pretty much every group, and I sat in most of the groups, is they said, we need more information, we need new information. So now, the time is right to potentially create that information in a creative and I guess a sustainable way where people can get it. So obviously we've got 2 approaches, the behavioural approach, and I've got Claire Anderson, that stands for you, the CA. So information about level of risk, so hours of sleep versus level of risk. So that may be one angle we'll take. Behavioural interventions, so delay the drive, plan the drive, have somebody else drive. A lot of those messages that we've already got. And then some of the mitigation strategies, avoiding driving when, and giving some examples of, you've only had this much sleep. Power nap, and health and sleep information. I think, there's real opportunity in a lot of forums that speak to sleep directly, that maybe we could get some of those road safety messages in there as well. I think there's a great opportunity for that. So, and this is my last slide, I've flown through. So one of the things I want to touch on, the semantics of sleep come up time and time again, and certainly has been already in this forum. And so I thought it was a good opportunity to put to, punters in the street about, what language best describes driving tired for them. And the short version is they liked a word that was stronger than just tired. They liked fatigue because they felt it had, sort of, I guess, was a better measure of how they understood the risk, or to get the measure of the risk across the line. But we will be testing this concept in more detail, or, the language, once we have something to take to concept testing. But I think, overall, we didn't find anything new or surprising. And as I said, the level of risk is and the opportunity to educate around that, I think, is the opportunity that we have in front of us. So for the next 9 months or so, we'll be working on a campaign that hopefully addresses the needs of the community. So I'm done. How quick was that?
Thank you. Thanks, Helen. And you're getting a big round of applause from the audience here if you didn't hear that, and from those online. Okay, any quick questions while Elle brings up another mentee there, because we do still have many people online still participating. Any questions immediately though? And well, we've got a few in the Q&A there, maybe. They may have been from other ones. Any questions from anybody in the room? Okay, everybody's just getting their mentee up and running again. Yep. Sorry. Oh, you just want to get rid of that. Okay. So Helen, yeah, talked a bit about language there. So what language do you prefer to describe driving while sleepy? Drowsy, fatigued, tired? Claire made some comments that may influence people on this one. None of the above? Right. For those online, Jeff's bumper sticker was "Stop if you're stuffed" for the truck drivers, which and did it resonate with them? Okay. Right. Okay. All right. Good. So thank you. Maybe we should have put an other option there and seen what other ideas. We'll have a bit of a workshop and we might come up with something. Let's jump on to the next one. What percentage of crashes resulting in serious injury or fatalities can be attributed to drowsy driving, from 0% to 100%? And that was actually mentioned in Michael's presentation, also from his sample study. And so we'll see what people say on that one. Okay. So we're seeing around the 33% there. Any comments, Claire? You're in the room? Oh, okay. Good. Okay, well, that's an interesting outcome. Let's go to the last one. So the idea of roadside fatigue testing or drowsiness testing or other term you want to use, testing, level of support around that. Wendy, question. Is there a blood test involved in this? Helen, if you're...
Claire's in the room, so she could probably answer that question best, but not obviously at the roadside. That would be quite complicated. But Claire, if you want to take that question.
So for those online, it was not a blood test, some other type of test. What would it involve, Claire? Something putting something on people's eyes? Okay, so behaviour ocular type tests for those online is where we're at. Okay, so we're getting a lot of support for that. And it might be one of the questions we workshop a little bit about some of the policy communication challenges we might have if we do get some technology, how we might be able to deploy it. But we'll workshop that a little bit. Helen, did you want to make any comments on the results you saw there? Hopefully you saw them on screen.
Yes, I did. Yep. I think everyone was pretty much on track. It is, once again, the semantics of, what language we use is going to be important, I think, particularly with community education. So, it'll be interesting once we take a concept to market and see what people's reaction to that will be, and whether we need to move away from the academic definitions of drowsy driving or whatever it might be. But yeah, no, so watch this space, everyone. Probably middle of next year, we should have something, a TV campaign ready to go and associated social bits and pieces.
Good, thank you. Okay, well, we might close off the online component of this now, and I'll just make a special thank you to our presenters, and thank you also to Wendy and Elvira for the organising of this, and for everybody that's logged in online and turned up in person. It's been fantastic, and we certainly will be continuing the conversation in person. I want to remind you all of the Australasian Road Safety Conference, which will be in Christchurch later in the year. And it's a fantastic opportunity for those that can get over to New Zealand, but there will be some online components as well. So please check that out and sign up. It's a great opportunity to learn the latest going on. And just mentioning also the college, and we have our chapter chair here, Chris Harrison. So I might invite you to come up and just say hi and tell us a little bit about the college. Sorry to put you on the spot, but I saw you there, and we love having you here.
Okay, well, firstly, I just want to thank everyone online and in person attending this webinar workshop. Really interesting research, and I know from the work that we do with people who have been impacted, post a crash, and I was just thinking alongside all these research, some of the stories where people have lost loved ones as a result of falling asleep on holiday or coming back from work. So thank you, and yes, a reminder about the roads, the Australasian Council for Road Safety. I can't even talk. I'm fatigued today. Just getting here was traumatic for me. So yes, it is an opportunity to network and to really bring all sides of the story around road safety together. So the more that we can get together, like events like this, I think it's a great opportunity to really look at it. So thank you, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one too.
Okay, and a final thank you to everybody for logging in. Those here in person, we're going to do a little bit more activity, but for those at home or at work, your workplaces, thank you for logging in.